time in our service where we collect an offering. To those attending MCC Boston through our YouTube channel, you too can participate by going to our website at mccboston.org and clicking on the donate button there for that purpose. Thank you for being a part of our church family. Members and friends of MCC Boston, occasionally our denomination and MCC Boston in particular gets criticized for being too focused on justice issues. But one need only look to the Bible to understand just how foundational justice work is to being a Christian. We're reminded of this interconnectivity this week as we celebrate the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who firmly believed in the inseparable connection between Christian faith and social action. As queer people, we're thankful for the work of Dr. King and mindful that our own liberation wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Barbara Smith, a black lesbian feminist who was an early proponent of the inclusion of queer people, wrote that the civil rights movement is where we learn that ethical and spiritual as well as political transformations were possible because we experienced the changes within ourselves. In other words, real change comes from opening our own hearts and minds and then calling one another into greater advocacy. So this week, give thanks for the witness of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and for his leadership in the civil rights movement. And then look within your own heart and mind and continue to work for change.
Tonight's reading is from John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. 3 days later, Mary, the mother of Jesus, was at a wedding feast in the village of Cana in Galilee. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited and were there. When the wine was all gone, Mary said to Jesus, "They don't have any more wine." Jesus replied, "Mother, my time has not come yet. You must not tell me what to do." Mary then said to the servants, "Do whatever Jesus tells you to do." At the feast, there were 6 stone water jars that were used by the people for washing themselves in the way that their religion said they must. Each jar held about 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus told the servants to fill them to the top with water. Then after the jars had been filled, he said, "Now take some water and give it to the man in charge of the feast." The servant did as Jesus told them, and the man in charge drank some of the water that had been turned into wine. He did not know where the wine had come from, but the servants had. He called the bridegroom over and said, "The best wine is always served first. Then, after the guests have gone and had plenty, the other wine is served. But you have kept the best until last." This was Jesus' first miracle, and he did it in the village of Cana in Galilee. There, Jesus showed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him.
So, I don't want to sugarcoat what I've got on my plate with this sermon, even though I know I also put every single item on that plate myself. But here's the thing. Because theology needs to be grounded in our daily lives, I believe that a responsible preacher will at least acknowledge in any sermon important events that have happened or will soon happen, such as, for instance, a federal holiday celebrating our nation's most cherished civil rights leader. And of course, there are far too many acknowledgments of Martin Luther King Jr. that reduce his legacy to 1 or 2 quotes from 1 or 2 speeches that a whole lot of white people like myself have used to continue denying justice to the black community by completely removing Dr. King's writings and actions from any meaningful context. Also, you are probably aware by now that I am very much a lectionary man, and I deviate from that only in exceptional circumstances. So I have about 4 or 5 passages to choose from and preaching them in such a way that also honors responsibly the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. And the wedding at Cana doesn't quite fit with that one. It's a bit of a challenge. Now, my approach to sermon writing varies a little from gig to gig. I always try to read through a few commentaries, but my thought process while reading and writing and structuring can happen several different ways. Sometimes I'm already aware of where I want to end up, but I still have to figure out how to spend 15 to 20 minutes getting to that point. Sometimes I have no idea where things will go, but I know that I have a bone to pick with whatever particular passage I'm reading, and the challenge is to resolve that tension between me and the Bible. But some of my favorite experiences come from weeks like this one, where I really just start reading with a question about the text in mind and see where the deeper reading takes me. And as I began digesting this text, the big question I couldn't quite answer for myself was, why the wine changing first? Because in this text, changing the water into wine was Jesus' first miracle, in many ways the beginning of his ministry. And the more I think about it, the more that feels like a weird place to start. Particularly in the context of this year of liturgy, we're mainly in the Gospel of Luke until December, which means that the weeks of Advent and Christmastide and Epiphany have been very full of a lot of big ideas about lifting up the poor and lowly and casting down the mighty and a whole lot of other justice talk. And then Jesus' first big outing here was, if you'll forgive me simplifying, the divine equivalent of making a liquor store run in the middle of the party. It just feels a little anticlimactic. And yes, when considering the liturgy of past weeks, that was Luke's gospel, and this passage is in John's gospel. But then the majority of scholars believe that John's gospel is written after Luke's. And if you're writing a gospel, I feel safe assuming you have at least passing familiarity with other gospels, especially those like Luke's who have gained no small amount of traction. Even disregarding that, though, John's gospel up until this point hasn't really undersold Jesus either. It's less talk of reversing fortune and lifting up the oppressed, and more talk of giving life to the world and being the light in the darkness. But these ambitions still feel quite a bit loftier than transmutation into alcoholic beverage. When one considers the other 6 signs of Jesus written about in John's gospel, they also seem a bit out of step with Jesus' first miracle here. Apart from the water into wine, we've got Jesus healing a sick child, healing a paralytic, feeding hungry masses of people, walking on water, healing a blind man, and finally raising Lazarus from the freaking dead. Do you see how all of these feel a little more weighted with importance than keeping the wedding party going longer with fresh supplies? I mean, the walking on water feels potentially a little showboaty, but I imagine it would read pretty differently to a group where like half the people are fishermen. And aside from that, it's all healing and feeding and re-alive making. And all public miracles, both being performed in public, that is, in front of people Jesus didn't previously know, and also mostly miracles being enacted for the public, that is, benefiting people Jesus didn't previously know. And so the more you look at them, the more the big water into wine miracle starts to stand out. And I'm a guy who is really into the idea of starting and ending on the right note. So this being the first one out of the gate bothers me more the more I think about it. And while we're here, it would also just be the responsible thing to talk about what it means to have so much wine imagery in our sacred text. And you all know that I'm not someone who's going to tell you that booze is the devil and good Christians should practice complete temperance. Even if I wanted to, I've run into several members of this church in bars before. And truthfully, I don't think any intoxicating substance is in and of itself inherently evil. I have expressed to several of the opioid users I work with on numerous occasions that I wouldn't care about whether or not they used that substance if it didn't ruin their lives and often kill them. And alcohol, while it also is not in and of itself the devil's spawn, ruins a lot of lives and kills a lot of people. Trust me. It's a sick disease that makes someone want to slowly poison themselves to death, and it is very, very difficult to watch and immensely more difficult to suffer. So while I enjoy myself a nice whiskey more than occasionally, I also wonder if it's a great idea to place alcohol in such high regard in our religious texts. So when I started reading commentaries to prepare for this week, it was with a sudden burning need to know why, of all the first miracles Jesus could have performed, he would start with wine. And what I learned was that every other theologian I read had a different burning question about this passage, and none of us got any good answers. The response was instead several textual refrains of, John isn't concerned with this detail. For some, the important question was, why did they run out of wine in the first place? After all, while it should be noted that in this context, wedding celebrations lasted for days and people came and went as they pleased, surely the celebrants of these particular nuptials were aware that they were having a wedding and might need supplies for it. Some theologians have attempted to explain this feature by saying that Jesus and his several guests to the wedding were not anticipated, and therefore it was partially his fault the supplies ran low earlier than expected. And while this does explain a few other curious features, there really is no textual evidence to support this theory because those details were not John's concern. For others, the notable thing here is the sheer amount of water changed into wine. If you didn't catch this bit, there were 6 jars, each containing 20 or 30 gallons, which makes 120 to 180 gallons of wine, which is a lot of wine. A lot. Aside from the fact that this makes me feel really awful for the servants who had to carry those jars back, this is notable to some as a sign of God's abundance, that God would provide far, far more wine than we'd expect. Some have theorized that, in actuality, only the wine in the cup was given to the steward, was actually transformed. The rest stayed water. Others have theorized that the sheer abundance of wine is a fulfillment of a few writings in the prophets about wine in abundance. Though upon closer examination, the 2 verses I saw cited, one in Joel and one in Amos, say nothing about a transformation into wine or any particular figure providing the wine. They both essentially say the mountains will drip with sweet wine, which seems like a thin similarity for a genre steeped in rich eschatological visions exactly like that one. In the end, though, there is no textual evidence to support any of these conclusions because those details were not John's concern. For still others, the big question in this passage revolves around Jesus' mother making the request and Jesus' response to it. For one thing, just to explain real quick, the term used in the text, which our translations used as mother and some use as woman, either way, reads a lot nicer in its context than it does in ours. It does draw some distance between Jesus and his mother, which is unexpected, but it's not a rude term as some readings would have it. Also worth noting is that Jesus' mother is not named in John's gospel, so it wouldn't be wise for us to have expected him to just say Mary. To others, the question is why Jesus would say this to his mother and then immediately proceed to address the exact situation which Jesus is representing as not any concern of his. There's a general consensus on this point that Jesus is making it known that he is not subject to his mother's will, nor that of anyone else save God, so he did not act on the wine until God willed him to do so. This is a plausible read. It fits in very well with John's method and ideology. Nonetheless, there is no direct textual evidence in this passage to support any of these explanations. And finally, no one at all that I've observed had any questions about the steward's comment that you have saved the better wine for later. But I'm bringing up this moment anyway, just to say as a public service announcement that in general, drinking the cheap stuff before the good stuff is not a good idea, and you're liable to give yourself a really nasty hangover. So I would advise against that, no matter how biblical it may be. In the end, it turns out that my question too has been left unsatisfactorily answered because that detail was not John's concern. But then that is pretty much exactly the nature of biblical literature. Those who will tell you that biblical interpretation is simple and that the Bible just says what it says are often subject to Dunning-Kruger. Biblical literature and religious literature in general was not written to answer all of our questions and tie theologies up with a nice little bow. Gospel writings especially were intended to convey to the audience who Jesus is and what his story was, often in an experiential sense. But the person of Jesus and his story were not to be understood by their writers as something straightforward and easy to understand for anyone who can read. These people were writing about signs and wonders and miracles and all things that are mysterious and difficult to explain. And it really makes no sense for us to expect anyone to be able to explain the mysteries of God. That's their mysteries, and that's kind of how they work. What we should do with literature like this is wrestle with it, ask the questions, explore the argumentation, see things from many angles, and decide from our perspective how it best works. So all that is to say, there are no clear answers from the text here I can give you, but this is what I've been able to find and what I make of it. First off, there is strong contention for many experts that the miracle of changing water into wine originated with the cult to the Greek God Dionysus. This would predate John's gospel by at least a few centuries and would have had purchase in his context due to the existence of a cult to Dionysus in present-day Syria at the time. So it's a pretty plausible explanation that would make sense given John's aims in the text. The only drawback is that there is no account of Dionysus changing water into wine. Dionysus made wine through a vineyard. Yes, he was a magical wine deity, but the wine was still made the way all other wine is made. He did gift one woman, appropriately named Wino, with the power to change water into wine. But there is no account of he himself ever performing this miracle. So there's no source from which to draw the story of a figure changing water into wine as a sign of their divinity, as is explicitly stated here. Which is really good in the end, because the Romans already stole all of the Greeks' mythology, and other people don't need to steal it more. Beyond that, there's no clear and definitive answer to why Jesus would start his career with alcoholic transmutation. The question was not a concern of John's, and that's how exegesis goes sometimes. So everything I'm about to say should not be considered exegetical or claiming any loyalty to the information found in the biblical text itself. But near the end of my reading, I did counter something that felt a little bit better. Robert M. Brearley writes, "God does not want our religion to be too holy to be happy in." Throughout his life and his ministry, Jesus of Nazareth celebrated people. People getting married, people being healed of disease and deformity, people enjoying meals together. He carried a spirit of celebration with him wherever he went, as he proclaimed a God of mercy and peace and joy. This joyous feast at Cana is still a sign to the church that we are to rejoice in the people of God and to toast the world with the amazing good news of grace. Now, I think that particular characterization is bordering on hyperbole. Jesus was, in the stories we see, someone who expressed joy and celebration when appropriate, but I don't know that I'd characterize him as this sort of divine Spuds MacKenzie bringing the party wherever he goes. But I also think this raises an important point. The healing and feeding and raising from the dead, all the acts of Jesus that are designed to restore people to health and wellness, these acts do not happen to the exclusion of celebration and joy, but for the purpose of it. Jesus healed others and fed others, and yes, provided wine for others so that the people of God could celebrate and fellowship with one another and be in good spirits. If we get so consumed with the work that needs to be done to bring humanity and the world into a sense of wholeness, then we will forget what that sense of wholeness looks like. And my guess is it looks a bit like a party. I've been reflecting lately on how we have this tendency to, when we deify people like Jesus or Reverend Dr. King, we tend to forget about their humanity in the concrete sense. Forget that they were people like us. who did dedicate themselves to good and important work, and who used their skills to great effect to accomplish a purpose. But also, they ate and drank. They had conversations with personal friends, and they sweated and they farted and had the same moments of doubt and self-consciousness and silliness and joy as all the rest of us do. Have you noticed how, whenever a well-beloved celebrity dies, we all kind of get flooded with these stories about them? But the stories are never about the big accomplishments because we already know those things. The stories we feel compelled to tell in the wake of loss are all of the small moments of generosity and joy and love that people shared with these figures that we've rendered larger than life. The reminders that people who accomplished great things also just had regular moments in their daily lives. And this tendency to deify people and eclipse their humanity can become dangerous, too, in some ways. Witness Reverend Dr. King. We all know the important strides made in this country because he used his voice and spoke out about the evils of the world. And yet, when we deify a figure, we don't tend to take on their values so much as ascribe our values to them in retrospect. Which is why so many people who continue to daily support the dog whistles, the discriminatory legislation, the ongoing dehumanization of the black community that still escalates to this day, so many of the people who stand in direct opposition to everything Reverend Dr. King stood for and said will co-opt his legacy and perversely use his words to tell the rest of us to sit down and shut up. They've convinced themselves that the real legacy of Reverend Dr. King is all of us getting along and living in peace, and they conveniently glossed over the distinction between a negative peace and a positive peace, which means to them any tension in the world is the fault of those attempting to point out injustice rather than the fault of those who perpetrate injustice in silence. It's easy for them to do that because they've allowed themselves to forget the daily humanity of Reverend Dr. King. Because they've taken his legacy and divorced it from the context, from the daily life he lived. Because they've allowed their own mistaken view of his legacy to eclipse the hope in a better world that he sought to bring about through his actions. That's what happens when you get so fixated on the big missions that you forget about the daily life. So the best explanation I can give you in the end for why Jesus started his career by keeping the party going instead of healing and feeding and whatnot is that I think he wanted it known that God is not a God who joins us only for special occasions and very important work, but who is with us too in all the daily moments that form the actual substance of our lives. Now, I have a dear friend from back in my summer camp days, Jonathan Gowan. And the interesting thing about my friendship with Gowan is that I still vividly remember our first interaction, and it was one that made me really hate him. Nothing huge or life-destroying, just a staff softball game, and I was at bat, and he was pitching and heckling, and I wanted to hit him real bad. And sometime after that, he became someone whom I love very dearly, but I could never even begin to tell you when I went from hating him to loving him. It happened slowly, over hundreds of small moments, a lot of meals shared, a lot of conversations had, a lot of life stories exchanged, and I can maybe remember a handful of those moments in detail. But this always reminds me that the things that make up the big friendships and the big movements in our lives are thousands of small moments of so little consequence that we can't even remember them. And in using his first miracle to keep a celebration going, I think Jesus is making a point of telling us not to forget moments like that one. I think Jesus tells us to focus on the little interactions, the small talk, the jokes exchanged over a glass or two of wine. I think Jesus is telling us that our God is a God of these small daily interactions that we tend to overlook. I think Jesus is telling us that our God is not a God who would reduce the sum total of the life of one of the most important men in our nation's history to a few choice lines from one 16-minute speech. And I think Jesus wanted it known that his ministry was one that celebrated a God who was with us in the small moments, every little interaction, and every shared glass of wine. And I think that's something that's really important to know about the God we worship. Thank you.